Hi ladies and gentlemen, I'm Val, welcome on 18 Squad Lab. Today I share with you my 10 tips to improve your airbrush painting skills. If you are a beginner in scale modeling or if you are struggling to get a nice result with your airbrush, this video is for you. And believe me, if you follow these steps, you will get immediate results. If you like the content of this video, please encourage me with a thumb up or even better, subscribe and hit the bell to stay in touch with other scale modeling tutorials. That's the best way to help creators like me. Already many thanks, and let's dive into the content. First tip, go for lacquer paints. Avoid acrylic colors or enamel colors if you are starting or struggling with your airbrush. My two brands of reference for lacquer paints are Tamiya paints and Real Colors coming from AK Interactive. The biggest advantages of these paints is that you can dilute them much more than other paints while still maintaining a nice pigment distribution. The second big advantage of these paints is that the paint flow through the airbrush needle remains fluid and smooth. You have much less problem of needle clogging with these paints. My tip number 2, avoid airbrush needles that are too thin. These needles having diameter like 0.16 millimeters or 0.2 millimeters are useless if you are starting with scale modeling or if you experience problem with airbrush painting. These super thin needles will complicate your task. It will clog regularly, and the paint flow will be much more irregular if you are not proficient in using these needles. I bought this super expensive Iwata Custom Micron when I was younger, convinced that with that super weapon I would create much nicer models. Well, I must admit it wasn't the case. It all started with bent airbrush needles, broken pieces, paint clogging, too short cup capacity, and finally, I don't use it anymore. Tip 3. Use the brand thinners. The Tamiya one is lacquer thinner and normally should have a yellow cap. I don't know why mine has a white cap, it's unusual. I'll come back on dilution later on. Lacquer paint from AK Interactive also come with their own thinner, which is the high compatibility thinner for Real Colors. If you want to achieve the best performances out of your paints, you have to work with the brand thinners. Do not use homemade mixtures. Do not think that isopropylic alcohol can be mixed with everything. It's wrong. Brand thinners have been specifically designed for a specific paint to achieve a nice paint flow through the airbrush needle and a nice pigment distribution, even at high dilution ratio. So avoid to spare money on your paint thinners. Tip number 4. For a nice airflow, try to work with an air compressor, which has a spare air tank. Here is a picture of mine. It's not so expensive. It has an air tank of 3.5 liters, which is much than sufficient to provide a constant airflow in your airbrush. Tip 5. Air pressure. It's not rocket science. Basically, for most of the work you will do, the air pressure will be in between 1.5 and 2 bars. Above 2 bars, I think, it's my opinion, that it's not necessary, it's too much. You might encounter problems of spider webs, paint splashes, or too much paint reaching your model. If you need to increase pressure above 2 bars, that's probably because your paint dilution is wrong. You should dilute your paint much more. For precision painting, you will probably need to approach the surface much more and to reduce the air pressure. In that case, like on these images, it's best to reduce the pressure around 1 bar. It's an high pressure to work thin lines, for example, to draw the limits of a camo scheme. In that case, obviously, the paint should be diluted even more to be even more fluid. The thicker the paint, the more the pressure and the bigger distance between your airbrush and the model. Which brings us to the next tip, tip number 6, distance to the model. Well, for a normal work with a pressure in between 1.5 and 2 bars, the distance between your airbrush and the model should be something like 4 centimeters. Might be a little bit less, might be a little bit more, but it should be close to 4 centimeters. When working with 1 bar, for precision painting for example, this distance will reduce to approximately half of this distance, so around 2 centimeters, like here on these images. Working too far from your model, and the paint might dry during the travel between the airbrush needle and the model, and you will end up with a rough coat of paint on your model surface. Working too close of the surface might end up in spider webs or excessive paint amount on the surface of the model, which is basically the same as if you were working with a too high pressure. Tip number 7. Clean your airbrush completely if you use 2 different thinner consecutively. You might have read that spraying thinner through the airbrush is sufficient to clean it, as from the moment that what comes out of the airbrush is transparent. Well, let's verify this statement. The problem is that if there is any thinner residues from one type into your airbrush, it will mix with the thinner of the other type later on, and this might be sufficient to reduce the performances of your airbrush, or let's say, it might reduce the quality of the next paint mixture. Here is the result. The thinner that came out of my airbrush was transparent. Nevertheless, as you can see, there is still some thinner and paint residues on my airbrush needle, so that's not very nice. Next tip, tip number 8. Try to airbrush as perpendicular to the surface as you can, especially when there are corners. Now, it's not always possible to be perfectly perpendicular, but let's try to make it when it's possible. The danger, like here for example, if you are spraying not perpendicular, is that your paint mixture will also be projected on other surfaces behind the target. The first problem that it will create is that you will apply paint on other surfaces that you might not want to paint with this color. The second problem, which is a bit more annoying, especially in the case of corners, is that enclosed area and corners will generate air vortices, turbulent layers, and these turbulent layers will apply the paint on the surface on a very chaotic manner, and you will end up with a very rough coat of paint on the model that may need to be sanded afterwards. Let's address the next tip. That's a very common subject on social networks. Tip number 9, dilution. This is a very essential point with airbrushing, and this point is also linked to my first point, which was use lacquer paints. One of the worst enemies of the airbrush users are the small paint splashes. You know what I mean, all these tiny dots of paint all around your paint strokes. Well, it has to do with dilution most of the time, or needle clogging. Depending on the type of work you intend to start, the dilution might be different. Generally speaking, to cover wide areas, like a base coat, dilution should be around 60%. 50% is also nice. 5 parts paint, 5 parts thinner. But honestly, personally, I prefer to work with more diluted paint, generally speaking. So let's say for your base coat, 50 to 60% dilution is a good start. Now, for highlights and shadow, if you want to apply some effects, you can increase dilution up to 80-90%. So 8 parts of thinner for only 2 parts of paint, for example. Now, if you want to work really thin, precision details, super subtle effects and transitions, you might need to dilute even more than 90%. You can dilute, for example, 1 part of paint for 15 parts of thinner, and it works with lacquer paints. That will give you the capability to draw very thin lines and to draw much more complex camouflage patterns without having too much paint splashes around your paint strokes. Here, I'm doing streaks with dilution up to 15 parts of thinner for only 1 part of paint. That's very useful to create dust streaks or smoke streaks around gun muzzle brakes, for example. It's also very useful to dust a model and to create dusty areas in the corners. But it's also essential if you want to draw super thin lines with an airbrush. You must dilute a lot to increase the paint fluidity and reduce the risk of needle clogging. My last tip for this tutorial is practice, practice, practice. Go and get a very old model like the one I show you on these images that I found in my scale modeling club. It was an abandoned model, and do your experiments on this model. Give yourself time for progression. Start with a 0.4mm needle before trying to airbrush with a 0.2mm needle. Try to start first with lacquer paints, and only when you become proficient with these techniques, you can start thinking about going for a 0.2mm needle or other types of paints, like acrylics, special varnishes, primers, or whatever the type of paint. Also, keep in mind that sometimes, it's not common, the manufacturer provides guidelines on your paints jar. So you can go and check directly on the bottle what are the air pressure and the needle size recommended, if any guidelines are provided. Well folks, that's it for this tutorial. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget the thumb up. You can subscribe and hit the bell to help me to promote this channel. Don't miss my latest video, the TBM Avenger Crashed at Sea diorama. The full diorama is almost done, so a next video is about to be released in the coming weeks. So stay tuned and greetings from Portugal. Ciao ciao.